In the first quarter, just as we moved out of the lockdown of 2020 and everybody started the new year, Caverton Helicopter Services offshore started big revenue within the period. Ghana is moving to stabilize Airtel Tigo after it took over this telecommunication company for $1. Now it's investing massively to turn it into a major player within the Ghanaian market. And BRVM, that's BICICI, profit after tax jumped 230%, 4.7 billion CFA franc last year. Full reporting season across the various jurisdictions, and West Africa not an exception. But let's get the conversation forward, because in January of 2019, the Nigerian government unveiled a new Nigerian Code of Corporate Governance 2018, which looks to institutionalize best practices in corporate governance in Nigeria. That code, or that document, laid down some 28 broad principles, 16 of which related to the board of directors and officers of the board, addressing diverse issues, including communication with and equitable treatment of shareholders, ethical conduct of business in relation to insider trading related third-party transactions, conflict of interest, and other corrupt activities, among many other provisions. Joining me now to discuss good corporate governance and board effectiveness in emerging and developing countries is Dr. Franklin Ngwu, who is the director in charge of the Sustainability Center at the Lagos Business School. Welcome to the show this evening, Doctor. It's good to see you.
Thank you for having me. Good evening.
Thank you very much. Let's take this straight from your book, Emerging Board Effectiveness, or Enhancing Board Effectiveness. What are the key issues for boardroom executives in emerging markets and developing economies such as Nigeria?
First of all, it's good to remember or recall that corporate governance is a set of rules and regulations that will help to manage the relationship between the shareholders, which we call the principal, and the managers, which we call the agents. So that's why we say that corporate governance is more or less how do you manage the principal agency problem. So if we bring it down to emerging and developing economies like Nigeria, so the key thing is in terms of the board members or the board of directors understanding and see how they can properly implement their roles in terms of leadership, governance as leadership. And there are three key areas. The first one is their fiduciary duty for the firm. The second one is what we call the strategic responsibility. And the third one is the generative responsibility or generative mode. So by the time you bring these three together, that is the fiduciary, the strategic, and the generative one, you have what we call shared responsibility or shared governance, which will now bring about effective leadership in the firm. So these are the three key things. But what is even more important is that, of course, you know that these rules and regulations will need to operate in an environment, or what I can call a legal system. So the legal system is very, very fundamental for the effectiveness of any corporate governance rules. So whether you have different codes, it's very important, but what is then more important is the legal framework upon which these corporate governance codes operates.
So, but why is good corporate governance critical in the overall national socio-economic development for emerging and developing economies?
Well, it's very important. At the center of financial stability, financial sector development, access to credit, private sector development, job growth, and all that is corporate governance. So a typical example is that if you have a proper governance of any firm, it means that investors will have that confidence. Of course, as you showed in your earlier report, that some share prices are going up. It means that investors are having that confidence that this firm will be properly or is properly managed. And that means that investors will now bring in more money to that firm. And when that firm now gets more money, it means it can now expand. It means it can now create more jobs. It means that the economy will start increasing. And it means that the employees also will start increasing consumption, which means a kind of cyclic economic development. So it is too fundamental and too important, not only for private sector, but also for public sector. Because when both the public sector firms and private sector firms are properly governed, it means that there is no way the economy will not experience positive economic growth.
But how can a good corporate governance and board effectiveness be instituted and enforced in the Nigerian setting? Because some of the code on corporate governance are not essentially laws by which you can necessarily say they're more moral suasion.
Of course, as you mentioned, it's more of, first of all, is that you need a properly understood legal system. And what makes a legal system to be effective is the extent to which the law is understood, accepted, internalized to enhance compliance. So it is very, very, very important. But what we come to Nigeria, you find out that the legal system that we have is more or less used for instrumental purposes. But the legal system is supposed to serve from both intrinsic and instrumental purposes. So there is a challenge we have in Nigeria. So we have a legal system which we are using, but in terms of internalization and acceptance and understanding, it's still very, very poor. And that is why you find out that the owners of business are very skeptical with regards to who is managing their business. And that is why you have challenges of board members or chairman or owners of business being very reluctant in terms of who will be on their boards, and in terms of who will manage their business, and in terms of their reluctance to even relinquish their positions. So you find out some people have been MD or CEOs of organizations, and after some years they will return back as chairman of those organizations. The reason being that the legal system that we have, the trust of that legal system is a bit questionable. So until we have a system where we appreciate our informal legal system and have a combination of both formal and informal legal system to enhance our effectiveness of our legal system, it will be difficult to have proper corporate governance in Nigeria.
Well, when we talk about corporate governance, when we talk about good governance, well, folks talk about the political and public office holders. They talk about private sector, private sector, good corporate governance. So how much more should private sector leaders do in engaging public sector office holders towards a more responsible governance as a whole?
I think it's too important, and is something that is supposed to be something that is given and accepted by both the private sector and the public sector. Because of course, for growth to come, it has to be driven by the private sector. So Egypt just launched a program whereby the private sector will drive growth in Egypt. So there is no question about whether the private sector should actually engage with the public sector. So I also argue that the different private sector organizations, organized private sector, should increasingly engage the government in different areas. So I'm talking about associations like Challenge of Bankers, Nigerian Bar Association, NASG, ICANN, NECA, and all that. So all of them should proactively be engaging the government in different areas. And particularly, we are in a crisis situation in Nigeria, whereby we need this kind of strategic engagement in the different sectors and different areas of our economy to create an inclusive, positive growth in the country. So
the President Buhari's administration put in what you call the Presidential Economic Advisory Council. And they've come up with a new program called the Poverty Reduction and Growth Strategy. And attached to that program is a new fund which will run a little bit like a private equity fund. So do you think this will be one of the vehicles for us to get things moving? Let's change the conversation to that when we return. Please stand by, Dr. Franklin Ngwu, and everyone. We'll be right back in 2. All right, welcome back to our Rise Exchange. The Presidential Economic Advisory Council is scheduled to formally unveil its new Poverty Reduction and Growth Strategy program next week. And that will be alongside the new Nigeria Growth Fund, or NIG Fund. That will be a private equity kind of fund designed to support capital projects, raise funds, among other things. For some insights into this and more is my guest still here in our Lagos studios, Dr. Franklin Ngwu of the Lagos Business School. Doctor, this was where we finished off before the break. So in your mind, give me your first word on this new Poverty Reduction and Growth Strategy program, which was signed off on by the Federal Executive Council on Wednesday, and the newly proposed Special Nigeria Investment Fund.
In terms of the proposal, in terms of the plan, it of course is commendable. It's good. But the question then is that, remember that we had Economic Recovery and Growth Plan. During the coronavirus, we had the Economic Sustainability Plan. Now we have this Poverty Plan. So the problem is not really about having different proposals or having different plans. The problem, there's something that they call policy impact assessment or regulatory impact assessment. So what it means that if you implement a policy for 1 year, 2 years, you sit back and review the policy in terms of the impacts you wanted to achieve and say, have you really achieved these impacts? What did you not achieve? What did you achieve? But the problem we have in Nigeria is that we keep rolling out plans, we keep rolling out policies without really proper assessment of why some of the plans that we've rolled out before did not really work very well, and see how we can now rethink some of these policies. So there's really no problem with having a poverty reduction plan. Of course, it is very important because about 81 million Nigerians are currently poor, described as being very poor. So it's good and is expected. But the question then is in terms of the execution of these plans to make it effective and to make it really achieve what we want to achieve. Remember,
what in your mind, Dr. Ngwu, what in your mind had been the bane when we use the word implementation? It sounds like one very big grammar. So what do we really mean when we said implementation? We've talked about poverty alleviation since the days of the military. You have the MAMSA, you have the Better Life for Rural Women, you have every sort, you have DFRI, all of them were all about poverty reduction, poverty alleviation. And here we are, the numbers keep increasing.
Exactly. So the numbers keep increasing. That means that we have to sit back and say, what are the root causes? Why some of these our programs or plans are not working? And I think, from my own assessment, that it relates with the structure of governance that we have in Nigeria. We have really outgrown this unitary or centralized planning process. So let me give you a typical example. Poverty rate in Sokoto State, Taraba, and Jigawa, about 87%. In Ebonyi State is about 76%. In Lagos is about 4-point-something%. In Delta is about 6%. In Edo is about 12%. So the question, you can see the variations and the differences. So then if you are planning a centralized poverty reduction strategy, how will it be implemented? So what I'm trying to say is that the structure we have in Nigeria, this unitary approach of planning certain programs will not work. So we need to rethink it and say how we can have a macro framework, but it's now left for the different state governments and local governments to start implementing some of these things. But that implementation might actually be challenged because of this structure of governance that we have, whereby Abuja more or less controls many things, and also the source of revenue of the states, which comes mainly from Abuja and others. So it's something that we have to sit back and rethink properly and say, what are the relation we have between the state and the local government, the state and the federal government, to ensure effective implementation of policies with regard to the peculiarity of the different states and local governments.
Okay, is it about money, funding?
Funding is part of it. It's one of the issues, but it's not really about funding. It's about the creative capacity and leadership required for effective implementation of these different policies. So, for instance, what is happening in Sokoto State is different from what is happening in Enugu State or Ebonyi State, as the case may be. So these are different peculiarities that require different understanding and different approaches. So what I'm trying to say is that funding is important, but it's also because of the structure of governance that we have in Nigeria that our governors and our local government are not thinking strategically to even properly fund some of these issues. So if you talk about poverty, the state governors and the local government behave as if to say it's the responsibility of the federal government. On the other side, on the other way, it's supposed to be the responsibility of the state and local government, whereby the federal government should be able to provide the necessary support and incentive and encouragement for the states to implement. So it's something that is fundamental that we're supposed to look into, is the structure of governance of Nigeria. It is flawed, it is not working, it has not worked, and it will not work.
Where is the role of the private sector? How can the private sector be placed at the heart of this poverty reduction and growth at the same time? We're trying to do two things here. The poverty reduction is the anti-malaria. The growth strategy is the multivitamin. So,
that's exactly, it relates to what I said previously. So yes. The private sector is very fundamental. It's supposed to be a center of economic growth. Remember that when you're pursuing economic growth, naturally, poverty will reduce because more people will be employed, there will be more consumption, there will be more demand, output will increase, possibly export, and all that. So that will now reduce poverty and all that. So what I'm trying to say is that the private sector is supposed to be the fulcrum upon which this growth, then indirectly, poverty reduction will take place. So what we need to do is that the federal government need to sit down with the state government and now invite the private sector and say, how do we create a proper strategy that will enable the private sector to play more critical roles in the economic growth and development of Nigeria. So the idea of Abuja having all the powers to dictate on so many things, we have outgrown that, as I've said it earlier on. So Nigeria is too big and too complex, and the peculiarities are very, very varied for us to be having one particular approach.
We're going to be sounding a little bit like going round in circles. But again, we've been doing that for decades, by the way. So that's this conversation about, fine. So we've had the economic recovery and growth plan and all of that. We're all prepared with the federal government, state governments, the World Bank, the FDB, the DFIs, everybody were part of it. But when it comes to, let's put the boot on the ground, nobody shows up, in a manner of speaking.
And the reason why people don't really show up is because, as a state governor, you sit down every 30 days, you receive an alert from Abuja, and that's big enough. So in terms of even IGR of the different states, of course you can see that once there's a problem with NNPC in terms of revenue from oil, we have a serious crisis in Nigeria. But it's not supposed to be that. So in terms of putting boots down, what I'm trying to say that state governors need to sit back and understand that they are the CEOs of different states. And with the assets that they have in different states in Nigeria, there is no reason why we'll be saying that a state in Nigeria should have 87% of their population described as extremely poor. There's no reason why a state should have 70% of their population to be described as extremely poor. So a typical example, when I was working in the UK, a university in the UK, their revenue in a year was higher than the budget of a state in Nigeria. The investment fund of a university is higher than the investment IGR of all the South-East and South-South states in Nigeria. And the reason being that the state governors and local government are not strategic in thinking what they can do to improve what they're supposed to do. A typical example is that if you look at Indonesia made about $12-something billion from palm oil and coconut. Why can't a state governor say, I'm going to plant 10 million economic trees in a year or in 2 years or in 3 years? That will give about 300 billion naira for that state. There is no state that makes about 300 billion naira from Abuja on yearly basis. So if they do something like that, it means that the state will now be empowered to actually address the poverty. And if you look at the poverty report, for you to be described as poor, it means that you cannot earn up to 137,000 naira in a year or 11,000 naira in a month. So if the state governments are serious, they should be able to address this issue without even working with the federal government, because they have the powers, they have the responsibility, they have the assets to achieve this.
Dr. Franklin, I got that business idea of the coconut tree. I might just do it. So let's just end the conversation there before some of our listeners pick up that idea and run away with about $200 billion, about $1 billion a year. So let's talk that after the show. Thank you so much. Have a great evening, Dr. Franklin Ngwu, Director of Sustainability Center at the Lagos Business School. Have a pleasant evening.